So welcome to our panel on policing, to protect and serve, policing reform in a challenging era. We have a great panel for you guys today, some great speakers up here as well. I'm going to go quickly through and introduce the folks that we have. First of which is Representative Phil King, right here to my left. He serves on the National Board of Directors for the American Legislative Exchange Council and also chairs ALEC Center on Innovation and Technology. In the House, he chairs the Homeland Security and Public Safety Committee and also serves on the Energy Resources Committee. He's a former police officer for 15 years and also continues to serve in the Texas State Guard. And he's a practicing attorney and small business owner. Thank you for being with us, sir. Next to him, we have Mike Hughes. Mike Hughes is the coordinator, easy for me to say, at the Hill College Police Academy. He started his career in 1984 in the United States Air Force and is a veteran of Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He is a retired captain in the Saginaw Police Department, and he also served as the police chief in Wasilla, Alaska. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, could you actually see Sarah Palin's house from your patrol car?
Russian. Russian.
On a clear day.
Yes.
And next to him, we have Randy Peterson. He is the senior researcher for Right on Crime in the Center for Effective Justice here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. He spent 21 years in law enforcement in Bloomingdale, Illinois, working patrol investigations, administration, and management. Upon retiring, he moved to Texas, where he was the instructor and director of the Tarrant County College District Criminal Justice Training Center, one of the largest training centers in the state. And I'm Derek Cohen. My background is in a previous life, I was a police consultant. I worked with violence reduction strategies and focus deterrence strategies in jurisdictions like New Orleans, Detroit, New Haven, Connecticut, which actually has a lot compared to Detroit and New Orleans, believe it or not, and basically working on gang suppression in those areas as well. So we have a really good discussion here today. We're going to take it from a more 30,000-foot perspective and then kind of get down into the weeds of basically what is policing, what does it do, and how can we actually improve some of the practices going forward and strengthen the practices here that we already know are working. And so that's what we're going to discuss here today. So, you know, I'd like to share a quick little anecdote. Yesterday was Law Enforcement Appreciation Day, and it reminded me of a situation that happened about a month ago. So many of you have kind of followed Right on Crime and the Texas Public Policy Foundation's work in criminal justice, knows that we worked very hard on the First Step Act, which was signed by President Donald Trump on the 21st. At the signing ceremony, there were representatives there from the Fraternal Order of Police and the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And, you know, of course, just like anything with government, we were running about an hour behind, I believe. And we ended up, you know, kind of kibitzing in the West Wing. And I was talking to the chief and I was talking to the representative from the FOP, and I said, you know, I wasn't aware that you guys were involved in kind of the reentry and recidivism reduction side of criminal justice reform. It's great to have you here. He says to me, he says, you know, we've been interested in this stuff in years, but no administration ever invited us to the table. And so that's one of the things I think you see in the landscape of law enforcement as a partner in criminal justice reform nationally, is you see that they are given the credibility they deserve as the boots on the ground in the areas that have to implement these policies and have to implement these laws. It is really good from a stakeholder perspective to get their perspective. So, jumping in, Randy, I want to use that as a jumping off point. You wrote, and you have written several times, about constitutional policing. Can you give us just a 30,000-foot overview of what is constitutional policing?
Well, I think, can you hear me? Okay. I think that when we talk about constitutional policing or conservative policing reforms, it's a return to the role that policing was really meant to do, right? Policing was not designed to be a revenue-generating arm of the government, right? It's the most intrusive arm of the government for sure, but the idea that the role of government is to protect individual liberty, to protect rights, and to ensure safety, right? That's the role of the police, is to protect rights and to preserve the peace. Serve and protect is not just a motto, that's legitimately what they were, but we've strayed pretty far in a lot of respects from that original role. We have the police do a lot of things now that are not necessarily in keeping with that role. Some of the things that we would talk about in that are civil asset forfeiture, and what role does law enforcement play in that? Should it exist? How should it exist? Those kinds of things.
And Mike, building off that, so you've been in administrative roles in a couple agencies. What is one of the things, especially when it comes to, let's even say Alaska specifically, and the weather not being one, but there are many overlaps kind of in the rural nature of Alaska and that of Texas. What are some of the overlaps that you see specifically in the role of policing there versus the role of policing here? And what are some of the areas that we get right and other areas that we should look at for evaluation and improvement?
Well, one of the major issues I see is we want to use the term law enforcement and police and look at those as the same thing. Law enforcement is one of the roles in policing, but most communities want to be policed, but that goes to issues such as quality of life. Everybody wants a good quality of life, that they can enjoy their parks and have good streets and walk down, unlike what I had this morning, and not be accosted on the street by every person that you run across. I think a bigger issue is that the police are being more involved in quality of life than writing tickets to everyone for minor violations and things like that. I think that's nationwide. It's not just Alaska and Texas. That's a role that I think that we should revisit, and it kind of ties back into some of what Randy is talking about, is our role as a protector of individuals' rights, more so than an enforcer of the law.
And Chairman King, let me try to get a little bibliographic here. So, as I mentioned earlier, you ascended to the chairmanship of the Homeland Security and Public Safety Committee after a notable career in law enforcement. What is it that called you to that committee specifically, and how do you view your work on that committee, kind of in the general vein as we discussed here about constitutional policing, about improving the quality of life and things that Mike mentioned as well?
Yeah, maybe kind of a precursor to that is, think about it, just for me. So I was a cop back in the 80s and in late 70s, and then I stayed a reserve for like 20 years after that. But thinking in terms of how much law enforcement has changed. So when I was a police officer, I mean, we were running on drug labs, and we were dealing with gangs had really emerged and were really taking off then, and we had a lot of street violence, and it was kind of a rough kind of cowboy and Indian type time in that sense that you had a lot. The prisons then were full, and for everyone that got a year, they served a month, and so it was really just for everyone you let in a door, you had to let out, and so we had this really hot period of street violence, and it was dangerous, and it was hectic, and we learned a lot and grew a lot through that time, but it's completely different than how it is today. I mean, we were dealing with bad guys and drug dealers and little gangsters and things like this, and we had the issues we had to deal with. But today, it's a whole different thing. Not only do you still have those things, but in addition to that, you've got anarchists, and you've got assassins, and you've got instead of just gangs, now you've got our gangs that are prison gangs and our street gangs that are now interacting, all of them directly with the drug cartels. Instead of cooking meth in the neighborhood or out in the country, now probably 60% or more of all the drugs coming into the United States come right across that Texas-Mexico border and come up through our streets and into our cities and are dispersed to the rest of the country from there. And so you've got all the cartel and all the drug influence right here that our cops are having to deal with. You talk about the meth, the cocaine, the heroin, all of that pouring into our country through Texas. Heck, we just in 2018, fentanyl's kind of one of the big concerns right now. Police in Texas recovered 21 million lethal doses of fentanyl just in Texas last year. And we have no earthly idea of how much actually came in that was not, you know, confiscated. Obviously, much more than that. So it's really a different world for police. And then you get into all the world of the social media, or I think of socialism media. But you get into all the world of social media. Everywhere you go, there's cameras. The technology level, everything's monitoring. And then just all the community pressures, the cultural pressures that really make you remember a lot back to the 60s and the issues of law enforcement. So it's a whole different world. It's a much more difficult job at every level of law enforcement than it's, I don't know if it's ever been as difficult and as complex. So that's the environment they're in. Homeland Security is a little bit different. We have oversight in that committee for Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, so we kind of handle all the law enforcement licensing and training and all of those aspects. So we have just general oversight for the DPS. We also have the border security. In fact, I'm going to, right after we leave here, I'm flying to D.C. and going to be in a cabinet roundtable with President Trump on Homeland Security issues and border, and we're going to kind of talk through that. So Texas has a really neat role to play, both in law enforcement and with regard to Homeland Security. So it's a really interesting place to have discussions like this.
I couldn't agree more, sir. Thank you. Randy, I would like to ask you a question as far framing the representative's remarks. So, you know, you've written a great deal about police-community relations. Can you give us a summary of where you think police-community relations are, why that's important, and which direction you see it trending? And if bad, basically, how can we remedy?
Well, I think if you watch the media recently, you'll notice that Ferguson was kind of a flashpoint recently. I think we'll all say that was the case. And that was a low point for law enforcement community relations at that time. Right? We had movements that could best be described most generously as anti-cop movements that came out of it, but we also had some thinking law enforcement and thinking conservative reforms in mind doing that. But I think it's important to consider that a couple of years removed from that, we've learned lessons. Police departments are innovating, communities are innovating, and that relationship sometimes is cyclical. I think everybody on this stage can say, actually, Ferguson probably wasn't the worst event to happen in even our careers, right? All of us were police officers at the time that the Rodney King and the LA riots happened, and that was probably a lower point, at least, especially for California, but probably throughout the country as far as law enforcement relations. So it sometimes is cyclical, and a lot of times it revolves around a singular event that happens, and it points out an issue, and then we work on that issue. But where I think where we need to see this going forward is obviously we want to avoid those issues, right? We don't like those kinds of incidents where the fabric between the community and the police are a part of the community. They have to be. It's a strange duality, right? They're completely the government, but also completely part of the community, ideally. But where I think we need to move to that, and if you look at the policing project and some of the things that they're doing out of New York, they're talking about front-end accountability, right? Police officers are held accountable in a few different ways, right? You have administrative sanctions that can happen to them. If you commit misconduct, you can be fired or suspended or any of those things. There's civil remedies, right? They can be sued. There's criminal remedies. They can be charged if they commit a crime. These are all post-event, though, right? These are all things that happen that there's either genuinely illegal or that repulsed the community. Part of the problem with that part is that when we have something that we want to hold the police accountable for, but there's no accountability mechanism, it's hard to hold them accountable, and it's hard to explain that to the community that, well, they didn't really do anything wrong because there's not anything in place that says that they did anything wrong, and that creates a chasm, right, between the community and the police department. So one of the things the Policing Project has been looking at is this front-end accountability, saying, well, what if we had community engagement, right? What if the community was engaged at the front end on what policing should look like in their community, right? And that is, I think, the answer to going forward on how we are going to improve. When the community is involved, I would love to see a chief of police come forward and say, I'm gonna form a committee of stakeholders, community members, religious people in our group, and we're gonna meet, let's say, once a week for a year, and we're gonna go through our entire policy book, and we're gonna talk about it, and get some input from the community, and also explain why we do what we do. One of the things that the Policing Project has pointed out is that a lot of times in the community, every community is different, right? Policing is uniquely local. It changes from department to department, even if they're right next door to each other, let alone state to state like we were talking about. But if the community has a reflection in how they're policed, that can't but help to improve the relations between them. And I would love to see a chief actually do that and go forward saying, you know, now we have a policy manual, procedures are going to be policed, the community has had input in it, the community understands better why we do what we do or how we do what we do, or maybe the community says, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but it makes no sense, so we don't want you to do it that way anymore. Part of the issue that, again, that the Policing Project pointed out was that there tends to be a deference to the police department to kind of be autonomous. Like, well, they're the experts. You know, unlike private industry where in every other aspect of government just about, there's somebody in private industry that's doing it better than the government does, right? The government can look to private industry to say, well, that's a best practice and we can pull from there. But policing is a little bit different. It's all the government, right? So we don't have private experts in policing generally unless they already did it, and the community is a lot of times they defer to that expertise because they don't know any better and they don't want to get involved because they think, well, the police know best. But you know, I think all three of us can tell you that sometimes in policing we do things just because that's the way we've always done them, not because there's any good explanation for it. And those kind of things can sometimes get us in trouble and are fixable with community engagement.
Randy, I want to draw an underline under something you just said, because you highlighted almost the impossible mandate of policing in that. You both illustrated that the police need to be locally reflective or to mirror the community, the community that they police. You also highlighted that, community policing is not, there's no such thing as monolithic community policing, and the academic literature on that holds that as well. One of my friends at the University of Cincinnati wrote his dissertation, which 200 pages just to say we don't know what community policing is, and so I think that taken in tandem, that really shows how difficult it is for the police to be able to satisfy some of the missions that you've identified, some of the missions Chairman King identified, some of the missions Mike identified, all at the same time while having a moving goalpost as far as what should our use of force policy be, what should our investigatory policies be, should we be more liberal with warrant requirements, things like that. And so I just want to underline that I think that's a great illustration of some of the troubles that and some of the disconnect that we have with understanding police and their role currently. Now I'd like to move on to Mike. Mike, you are currently at a police academy. So how would you, in your role there, and this doesn't need to be a comment in your official capacity as an instructor at the academy, but what can we do in our training, be it our academic or our field training of police officers, in order to make it, to Randy's point, more locally responsive?
Well, I think pulling it down, you started out talking about a 30,000-foot kind of view of this, and I think part of the issue that we see is in policing is, well, let me give you this example. I would love to be a brain surgeon, but you don't want to trust me with a scalpel right now in doing that. And there's the same thing in policing. There's a lot of people that say, I want to be a police officer. They don't need to be police officers. Training or not, 643 hours, you pass a state test, you get to be a police officer. And but part of that is, are you the right fit for that role? Are you the type of person that can handle a very dynamic situation 1 minute and turn around and deal with community issues and neighbors being upset with one another and handle that with good quality communication skills? So I think to solve it at the 30,000-foot view, we got to start to revisit how we're hiring, how we're training, who we're hiring, and that that comes back to the local level. We would surely like to hire and mirror the makeup of our community. A police department that mirrors its community is a step in the right direction. From a training perspective, we're moving in positive directions. We're starting to understand that to train individuals to do police work, there are probably better ways, but you have to also think about too is I'm asking someone oftentimes fairly young, we'll say not quite socially mature yet, to come in and learn everything from first aid to communications to firearms to crisis intervention to a host of topics, and then turn around, go through field training and put that to practice in the field. So it's, I think, broader than simply building relationships with the community. You got to have the people who are capable of building those relationships with the community. And I'll come back to saying that involves getting the right people, finding the way to recruit those individuals. Policing has traditionally had here's the job advertisement, come apply for the police department and we'll decide whether we like you or not and put you through this training. But if I were running a Fortune 500 company, I'd be out headhunting and I'd be trying to find the best of the best of the best. Now, I've been a chief before, and if I were to try that, I would have probably got run off by the other chiefs because when I steal their best officers, that doesn't go over very well. So again, that's kind of where I think we need to go with selection and training in order to build these better relationships within our communities.
Thank you, Mike. Chairman King, so we've talked thus far about the competing mandates of what the policing mission is. We've talked about some of the realities faced by folks in both the hiring and training side as well. As a legislator, how do you balance both the competing needs of law enforcement, the competing needs of let's be honest, a very vocal advocacy community that's oftentimes not necessarily as a little more sizzle than steak on the policy itself, and how do you square the circle on finding something that actually advances policing and advances good policy while not putting our officers in danger?
Let me back up just a little bit too on that. So just following up a couple of the other comments, there's no question you've got to have strong community, strong neighborhood policing, strong relationships, and you look at places like Ferguson. If you want a model for it, look at Fort Worth PD over the last 30 years. Fort Worth PD has done an outstanding job of building relationships into the community. And so when they have crises arise, and every major city does, and our smaller communities do as easily as well now, then they've already got the bridge built. Once the crisis arises and the waters rise, you can't go build the bridge right then. So you have to do those years and years and years in advance. You have to build those relationships into the community, into the pastoral community, into the churches, into the schools, into the civic clubs, into everything. And that takes a lot of work. So if you really want a great model for that, look at Fort Worth PD. There's other good models around the state and country too as well, but Fort Worth's done a really, really good job with that. Now, the other side of that is we have to do a much, much better job of taking care of our officers. It is a very difficult job. It's more difficult than it's ever been. And if you don't recognize that the community and the state supports you and appreciates you and honors you, then they're going to go find something else to do. It's a lot like the military has been at different times. If we don't support and honor and show them our confidence and trust in them and honor them for the work that they do, then they'll go find other things to do as well. And so, we're really, I think, failing right now to reach out as our communities and say to the blue and whatever color uniform they wear that look, we're going to stand with you and we're going to support you and we're going to stand beside you in all that you do, and we honor your and respect your profession. And they need to hear that a lot more now. You can do that in a lot of different ways. You can do it through organizations doing awards. You can do them through public recognition. You can do it just coming alongside them. Hundreds of ways, organized and unorganized, to do that. A lot like we kind of do the military. You walk in. I mean, I've been having officers tell me they can't believe it's just so interesting now. They'll walk into a restaurant and someone will come up and tell them, thank you for your service, and pick up their check. Little things like that. You can't believe how far things like that go. So we've got to do a big deal with that. As far as is I think the state, we've got interesting, like in the Homeland Security Committee last time, we spent all our time basically on two major bills. One was the Sandra Bland Act and looking at that, and the other was whether or not we should have constitutional carry on firearms. And those are very different issues, and really dominated it all of our time, almost for the whole session. So law enforcement is very much a reflection of what's going on in the community. It's a reflection of all the contemporary issues that are going on. Law enforcement's a big reflection of what's happening on social media right now. And so the states, our job, as I see it out there, is to make sure that there's adequate training and funding for those things. School security is going to be a big part of that as we look at this session, I think, in what type of boots on the ground do we need to have in those schools, what type of support needs to come from the state for that. But at the state level, we're primarily just responding to what's happening out there on a year-by-year basis. And that changes.
Definitely, certainly. Now, Randy, you've written extensively on the 1033 program, and this is not, it is not without controversy, to say the least. Can you give everybody an overview of what the 1033 program is? How does it benefit law enforcement, and what are some areas for improvement that might make it more reflective in what you've termed before as your constitutional policing model?
If you're not familiar with the 1033 program, it's a federal initiative that transfers quote-unquote obsolete equipment from the Department of Defense to local law enforcement and state and county and even the feds. It's all military equipment, military-style equipment. Most of you, if you live in a community where you see those MRAPs, right, the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, a lot of people refer to them as tanks. They're not really tanks, but that's they say the police had a tank and driving in the parade, and it's usually those MRAPs. They're extremely expensive vehicles. Police departments don't buy those. They get those through the 1033 program. Okay, the Department of Defense transfers that free of charge. I think they just pay shipping for that, and then any equipment that they have to put on it. There's firearms available, all of those things. So there's a lot of military equipment, and that gets probably the most attention. But there's also other things, right? They get office equipment, rain gear, uniforms in certain cases, computers, and all of those things can also go. So there's arguments on both sides of this. There's one is, do police agencies need that? Is that a good thing for our agencies to have that? Then there's the flip side of, all of that equipment has already been bought with taxpayer money, so it's already kind of been paid for, at least in part, by that community anyway, and if the military doesn't need it anymore, why not repurpose it? But there's not a lot of limits on a department acquiring this, right? That's kind of up to the municipality. So if the village manager or the mayor says, well, I don't care what you get if it's free, which who wouldn't? Hey, I'm getting a $250,000 vehicle for free from the government. Okay, great. I mean, that's a selling feature sometimes for them, right? Because that's what they're saying. I'm getting this value for free. So if there's no oversight on it, then the police department can just request and acquire all these different things. Going back to what we originally talked about community engagement, not everybody likes that, right? Not everybody likes looking out at their police department and having them look like an occupying force. That's not what we consider our civilian police to be. Is there a place for some of those things? Sure, right? If you have if we were to have a terrorist event, you have an officer down or citizens down, that's the only way you're going to rescue them is with one of those vehicles, right? Where you can actually go into gunfire with that. So I get it. There's a place for these things, but it's very, very rare. And the community should have some sort of say in if they want that there, right? There's parts of the country that would say, I don't think we need that, right? I don't think we want that here. And shouldn't they have some sort of say on that? So one of the things we had talked about was we would really like to see legislation that required the local governing body to approve any sort of acquisitions of this, right? That the city manager and the board would have to vote on something, and you'd have to have the police chief explain why we need this, what is it, what does it do, and then they can decide as the elected officials if they want their police department to look like that, right? I think a lot of times people are probably going to say, I don't think we want our police department to look like that, okay? But part of the issue, I think, with that is we've become accustomed to seeing that more and more often, right? We're desensitized to our police looking like soldiers. In and of itself, is that a big deal? Maybe not. But Peter Kraska, who has actually been the academic forefront of this, he's been banging this drum for 20 plus years about this problem with the militarization of our police. And one of the things he points out is the militarization is really just the buildup, right? The acquiring of equipment, the way we dress, all of those things. That's the militarization process. The problem is the philosophy of militarism, okay? Militarism is the philosophy that prefers the use of force over other options in any situation, right? Every problem is a nail and we bring a hammer to it, okay? That's militarism, because what is the root function of our military is to bring force to our enemies to further American interests, right? That is not the role of the police, right? For the military, a preference for force is what we expect of them. For our police, we want them to think of it as a last resort. So the militarization is sometimes a symptom. There's question as to whether or not it's causal of this philosophy of militarism. If you don't think that the militarism is an issue, I would point to some of our highest charged events that have happened, okay? The Mesa, Arizona shooting. I don't know if you saw that when Daniel Shiver was shot in a hotel lobby hallway. I wrote about it in a paper that I did. It's a perfect example of militarism where the police in that situation didn't take any opportunities that were available to de-escalate. Okay? And there were a lot of them present. And you don't have to be a police expert to watch this and say, why did they have to do that, right? And it very much demonstrated a preference to use force. And a young man lost his life because of it. It's an issue. The militarization part, and I know I'm going back and forth on here, is the part where communities need to decide what level. Every police department is somewhat militarized, right? Where it's a paramilitary organization. I don't know how you would not have one that was. But every community has to decide on that. And the resistance to militarism is the big part. And that comes a lot from what Michael was just talking about hiring and training the right people, right? Police officers are really unique. You have to be able to function as a counselor, a social worker, a de-escalator on one end, but you have to be a warrior on the other end too. If you have either of those parts missing, we have colossal failures. Parkland, Florida, we saw that, right? Police officer fails to go in on an active shooter while kids are being shot inside. You were lacking one part of that dynamic person. It takes a lot to find a good police officer who's able to fit in that really sometimes opposite roles. It's funny when we talk about militarization, though. Mike and I used to work at the same police academy, and a lot of our former military cadets that came through as cadets in the police academy really seemed to understand the difference between their role in the military and their role as police officers better than those who had never even been in there. And the military brings a lot of good aspects to, I mean, there's a reason why veterans and former military people are in high demand for jobs, right? They bring a lot of really good aspects to any job they come to, and particularly law enforcement. But they brought a real understanding of the difference. We had a couple of special forces cadets that came through our academy. I mean, you think about what the Green Berets do, right? When they go into a community that they don't know anything about and try to win them over and train them, right? And win over their hearts and minds. That's exactly what the personality of that we would want in a police officer, right? That we have somebody who's completely capable of fighting and defending their community, but really wants to be a part of that community and work through things without having to use force when necessary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very good, Randy. I'd also like to get Chairman King's perspective on 1033 specifically.
All right, first, training's everything in law enforcement, just like it is in the military, not just for muscle memory and everything, but it's just to be able to be exposed to different situations, scenarios, to work through them time and time and time again. Training is everything. And you've got to have a paramilitary structure because you've got to, if you order someone to go do something, that you've got to know they're going to go do that. And there's got to be terminal repercussions against them in the organization if they don't do that. So you've got to have strict discipline when you have emergencies. You've got to have that chain of command and that scope of command and all the things that you have to do there to take on an emergency situation. So you've got to have that paramilitary structure. That said, it bothers me a lot when our police begin to look like military because we've in the United States and in Texas, we've kept a very big distinction between local law enforcement. It's why we don't have a real big federal police. That's why we have a national policy that prohibits you from, Posse Comitatus, that doesn't let military perform law enforcement functions, is because we want them to be very, very distinct. And we want law enforcement to be local. It's where you have national law enforcement that leads to coups and all those kind of things, and our founders knew that. And so you want all law enforcement to be as local as possible. We got state police, but really we focus on local. And that's true nationwide. I'll admit, now I want our officers to be, when we get in tactical situations, you need that SWAT type ability there. You need the equipment for that, and you need the training for that, and you need to have the gear for that and all of that. But I'll admit, it bothers me to see so often our law enforcement guys and ladies in more of a military gear and in uniform than in a law enforcement, because our cops are supposed to be able to go in and talk to the kids at the elementary school and intermingle with people on the street, and it's supposed to be a different level of relationship and interaction than with the military. So I'm a little uncomfortable with that. I like our police to look distinctively different from the military, two completely different functions, and so when we arm up a little too much, I think we kind of take that. And also, cops are like everybody else. We like the bigger the gun, the better, and the bigger the vehicle, the better, and all of that. And there are times when you need to have an armored carrier of some type to go into situations, and you certainly need the SWAT gear on many occasions and all those things. But most of the time, we need to look as much just like traditional police officers as we can.
Thank you very much, sir. One of the things that you hit a really good point about the rare tactical situations. And I think that one of the areas that is relatively misunderstood or not well known in policing and policing policy has to do with how we police those particular tactical situations. Obviously there's a confluence of that in the militarization and militarism, as Randy was talking about before. But Randy, I want to go to you, and then I want to go to Mike for more of a training-specific question on it. Talk to us a little, because during your career, you spent a significant amount of time as, and Mike was up here earlier, I joked and called him a door kicker. So you spent a significant amount of time in a tactical unit in Bloomington, Illinois. Can you describe the scenario in which those are used, in which it is appropriate for those particular units to be used, and are we overusing them? Are we underusing them? And when we are using them, what are we staffing them up with in terms of the complement of skills that the officer has?
The department that I was on, we had a part-time SWAT team. So what that means is we all had our daily role, right? Patrolman, detective, sergeant, whatever you were. And then if you had a SWAT event, we would assemble officers from that to deal with the SWAT event. We trained relatively regularly, but I'm going to be honest with you, the role of a SWAT team is very specific, right? They were developed for very specific reasons. That was hostage barricade situations, very, very high-risk warrant services, and rioting, right? And it was developed in LA. Los Angeles was really the first SWAT team. Most departments are similar to mine, being that if they have a SWAT team, it's a part-time thing and they just assemble some officers. We were blessed with really good people. We had a really good hiring process, really good training process, but it was by the grace of God that we end up with a team that was relatively functional with how really little training we did. Now, Fort Worth is different. Dallas is different. Houston, they have full-time SWAT teams. That's all they do is SWAT. And they train all the time for this. So here's the issue. Those kind of scenarios where you really need a SWAT team are very rare, even in a larger city, okay? We use them a lot for warrant services, for possession of marijuana. There's no gun involved or anything like that. And you bring a SWAT team to this probably unnecessarily, right? The reason that we get warrants, and you know, you've ever heard of knock and announce, right? The requirement that police officers knock and then announce their presence before hammering the door down. There's also no knock warrants where they don't do that. Well, the reason that there's a knock and announce was to avoid violence. That was the court wanted to see us avoid violence. It gave the occupants of the home an opportunity to open the door for the police and allow them in to do their search without violence. That's the theory. In application, that's not the case, right? It usually ends up with a door broken down and things like that because the police consideration on the other side of that is the occupants can also go get a weapon. They can get rid of the evidence that I'm looking for. They can destroy that. So we've got to do this. So we have this little dance that happens, right? We knock and announce and then we blast the door open. So that's generally how that happens. That's not the way that was supposed to look. Part of the reason that that's a problem is because we're using SWAT teams for things like that, right? I think all three of us would say, yeah, we've all done search warrants, we've all done raids, and sometimes we do that. But if we were realistic with ourselves, we would question, but did we have to do that? Could I wait until the occupant got in their car to go get groceries and stop them on the street, take them into custody there, and then I have an unoccupied house that I can search without any problem? Or am I forcing a potentially volatile situation when I blast someone's door open? The biggest problem is, what if I get it wrong, right? I'm a homeowner and you somehow have an informant that gives you my address and you're coming through my door, blasting my door open, and I'm a law-abiding citizen. I would have no expectation that you are the police coming in. What would my response be to that? What might my response be to that? Tragic, right? Tragic potentially for the officers and for me, my family. SWAT teams do bring a massive amount of force capability to an event. Sometimes that's necessary. It's rare events that is absolutely necessary, and most of the time it's not. So if you ask me, I would say that we're overusing SWAT teams, and part of that is the way, as any of us up here would tell you, is the way a municipality looks at financing. SWAT teams are very expensive because of the amount of equipment and the amount of training that they need to do. If you have an agency or a government unit that looks at it and says, we're willing to have that as a very expensive insurance policy, and it's kind of sequestered away just for those worst case scenarios. You may never have to use them, but you keep them trained and equipped just in case, and you have the availability to use them. That would be great, but municipalities don't work that way. They say, you haven't used it in a year, it's gone, bye-bye. So what ends up happening is, that's part of the reason we overuse SWAT teams, right? Because we branch out and we say, well, we'll do them on every marijuana warrant, every search warrant. We'll do every search warrant with a SWAT team now, so that when we go before the board and they say, well, how much did you spend on SWAT last year? And we say, well, we spent a lot, but we used them 147 times. And we say, well, we must need it then, right? That's the way municipal financing goes with everything. That's why you'll have a fire truck with a ladder on it pull up at your traffic accident. It's not doing anything there, but it's not being used otherwise. So they have to justify the use by saying, well, it got called out, right? We used it this many times. SWAT teams are no different. If we had a different philosophy on them, SWAT teams would be beneficial in that sense that they're a very expensive insurance policy. But until we can come to that kind of a municipal financing understanding, they're going to continue to probably be overused.
Far be it to be a panel with Randy on it where he doesn't take a dig at firemen.
I have more to say on that if I have time.
We have to keep to the schedule, Randy. Mike, one thing I want to talk about, and especially with the development and utilization of the tactical units, is there something that we can do from a training perspective, or is there something that we can do more from a leadership development perspective, you yourself having the experience of being a chief, in order to really narrow the target of where these actual tactical units are being rolled out? Is there additional training requirements? Are there any training requirements that should be considered, or should it just be a catch as catch can with local governance in charge? Again, with kind of the suspect incentive structure that I think Randy outlined there before, flavoring it.
Well, there's no specific training requirements that the state mandates for SWAT or SWAT tactics or whatever term you want to call it. There are best practices at the national level, National Tactical Officers Association, the Texas Tactical Police Officers Association. So I think a step forward would be maybe putting some mandates in place there. The other is, if you look at some of those guidelines, there's some pretty clear, I'm not going to call them rules, but that if we're approaching a given situation, we make decisions based on logic and what we should or shouldn't do. And I'll give you an example. We would call it priorities of life, which would say a police officer will certainly, at the top of the list, put themselves in the line of fire to save an innocent person. If the shooting starts, who's driving? There's only really one group driving toward the gunfire, and that does not include the firemen. That's the cops, right? So we're driving toward this. And the second would be if someone's shooting up the neighborhood or shooting up the school, then we're certainly willing to put ourselves in the line of fire to go in and save people that may become potential victims. And again, this goes back to SWAT Commander Course 101. The third would be you, and the last would be, we'll say, the bad guy or whomever would be creating hate and discontent at that time. So when we arrive at these situations, and he said hostage barricade, if someone has taken another person hostage and we have to put ourselves in the line of fire, we want to do that, but we want to do that as safely as we can. We're going to do that. That's kind of what we swore to do. So I would say that a big part of that would be following those best practices, following those guidelines, instead of, hey, I think we'll break out the SWAT team for this. And, I like the hammer and nail analogy, that we break out the hammer every single time when maybe we need to look at another tactic. Just following some of those guidelines and maybe even mandating training for SWAT operations in the state would go a long way.
Chairman King, and I want to end the organized, the moderated discussion portion on this before going to the audience question and answers. You mentioned the Fort Worth Police Department, and I've heard them elevated not just in community relations, but in several aspects of policing is basically almost statewide best practices. What are some of the other best practices you've seen in your time, either on the committee or just in general, in certain departments, opportunity to brag on them, and opportunity to see some of those practices promulgated throughout the state?
Well, state DPS does a great job. Any agency, the keys to any agency is employee selection. Being very strict about your standards, not lowering your standards simply because you're having trouble hiring people or because your salaries aren't where they should be. You've got to have strict standards and stick to them. Training is essential, not just entry-level training, but continual in-service training all throughout their career. And supervision, and I think supervision is where we probably drop the ball more than anything else, is having good in the field and inline supervision for your officers, because they continue to need that. The problem police have is so like I remember I worked midnights for a little over 4 years straight at one time, and my days off were like Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So when I'm off, first off, all my friends are asleep when I'm off because I stayed on that schedule. And then the only other people that could go do something on a Tuesday and Wednesday evening were other police officers. And so you end up just spending all your time and all your and all your community becomes the people that you work with. And so then it kind of evolves into this we-they thing. And so one thing that Fort Worth, for example, has done really good, I think, is trying to move those officers into community settings and, you know, encourage them to be part of the Lions Club and part of the Rotary Club and things like that. So you're still a part of your community, and you don't get into this kind of we-they deal. But really, there's a lot of we have really good law enforcement in Texas. That doesn't mean you don't have some bad things happen occasionally. Doesn't mean some bad eggs don't fall through. But we have good law enforcement because, as a general rule, we focus very, very strongly on standards for employment. We focus very, very strongly on training. We try to focus on supervision. And I think we try to do a good job of showing that our officers are important to the community and that we appreciate them. And those are kind of elements that'll make that any place you see those things in part, you'll have really good law enforcement.
Excellent. Thank you very much, sir. Before we go over to audience question and answer, can I get a quick round of applause for our panel here? All right, well, thank you so much, gentlemen. Okay, everyone knows how this works. Please raise your hand. I will call on you, and our friend Michael Haugen will come bring you the mic. Just a couple housekeeping caveats. You know, we are a little truncated in the schedule, so anything that doesn't end with a question mark and an upward inflection might be interrupted. But let's be courteous, respectful, and the more we can kind of keep things succinct and to the point, we can get as many in as possible. This gentleman right here.
Thank you. The electrical grids in the United States, there's one on the West Coast, the left coast, the East Coast, and West Coast, and Texas goes a little bit into Oklahoma. For the chairman, what is your committee doing to protect our electrical grid here in Texas? And then the second part for everyone, sanctuary cities here in Texas.
Okay, two big questions. The electric grid, Texas is a little bit different. We're an island in our electrical grid. Almost the entire state is in what's called ERCOT. The rest of the country is under FERC. And so we've got a kind of an island of an electric grid, which is great in most of the state because we can control it rather than the federal government. We've been very careful not to let them tie into us in ways that put us under their authority. So his question is, what do you do to protect that? Electric grids are very, very, very vulnerable. I mean, you and I and a deer rifle can go wreak havoc by just firing rifle shots into little substations out in the country or in any community. We can have a traffic accident intentionally and knock down lines. The larger concern right now is with a lot of folks is what if you have a terrorist attack on your electric grid systems? You know, all I can tell you is we try to have very, very good security. We try to have a lot of redundancy so that if things are rerouting, we've been installing, we've gone to what some call kind of a smart grid where you have a lot of automatic instead of a lineman having to drive up and down the line after a storm or after something happens and try to literally look for the line. Now we have automatic rerouting as things through smart metering and things are able to detect that. There's a lot of folks that are very concerned of what if you had an EMP go off and just shoot everything down. That's a lot bigger problem than the electric grid, but here's the problem. So let's say you come in and spend the billions of dollars that it would take to sufficiently harden your lines and poles to your grid, your lines and poles, distribution system to protect it against an EMP. Well, then let's say you even spend the extra billions to really protect the power plants to where they are EMP protected. Well, so if it's a natural gas powered plant, so now you've got it protected, you've got the electric grid protected, but what about the fuel source that's got to get the natural gas that's got to get delivered? Well, how do you sufficiently EMP protect every natural gas well, every natural gas compression station, every natural gas cracking facility, the distribution center for that? So how do you get the fuel there and protect that? Or how do you make sure that the coal's going to get to them to make sure that those EMP protected coal plants are going to run, because that's trains and all the things that go into that. Kind of the joke has been after an EMP, the only thing that's going to work and need electricity is what was it? Well, nothing will. So the other thing is that if you provide electricity and get it to the homes and to the businesses, what are they going to have there after an EMP that'll actually run with electricity? So it's a really big, complex problem. So what we try to do is make sure we have good redundancy, good security, good response, and that we have an adequate reserve if a particular power plant or something goes down due to natural or intentional things happening. So, but the idea of being able to sufficiently protect against an EMP is a massive, massive problem. And even if you do completely protect against it, then who's at home that's got anything that electrical they can even use that electricity for? So it's a much broader question than just we're going to go harden the power plants or anything than that. And what was your other piece?
About sanctuary cities in Texas.
You know, we've outlawed fugitive cities. I like that word a lot better. Fugitive cities in Texas. We've made it where it's illegal to not cooperate with the federal authorities and ICE and all that in doing that. We still have some problems. We need to remind some of our community leaders at time that is illegal in Texas. We've even made it where you can be prosecuted for standing in the way of that. So we have outlawed that in Texas.
This gentleman right here in front.
Thanks. I guess you're going to hold on that. Okay. Okay. My question is psychology. You know, there is news coverage that's showing that at these protests, these anarchists, whatever, that they're actually trying to provoke, police forces. And then everybody's got their cell phone out and they're trying to have essentially a media war. And I know that's got to be very difficult, for whoever that individual is, to be spat upon, whatever. How are you, and then that makes the recruitment issue. It's just specifically, is there psychology training, that's being provided with this new world, of anarchist interaction with the police force?
A great question. So I think that some of the issues come back to just the basics of training in force within our police academies. We're starting, at least in some academies, we're starting to look at how do we do a better job at gauging someone's reaction in a scenario down the road. We certainly can't take our recruits out and fire guns at them and actually try to hurt them. But one of the things that we've discovered is that the more exposure to reality-based training that we can provide, the better they can start to process it. And I'll give you an example. And I'm not going to go here for very long, but let me get a tiny bit sciencey. So I've got a cadet, and I've got my role player or my legitimate actor, your Antifa or whatever. So oftentimes what happens is when we get in these elevated states, the front part of your brain, the thinking part of your brain shuts down, and we start reacting with our amygdala, which is your fight or flight response. So what happens there is I put a police officer who's now been shot into this elevated state, and they're thinking with a small part of their brain, and I've got the actor on this side who's yelling and screaming and not thinking with the cognitive part of their brain. And what we're trying to do with training is to get these officers to stay in the thinking part of their brain, because the reactions that you will often see are fight or flight on both sides of it. The officer gets put in this precarious position. They resort to whatever it is that's a survival response to them at the time. So the more we can expose them to those things, it's not going to matter if the Antifa person is standing face to face with them. If I can keep their brain thinking that you are not going to take me into a different state of mind here, I'm going to sit here and just absorb what you're having to say. The challenge of that is I'm asking a human being not to respond to that sort of pressure. But the only way we get there is train, expose, and all that, because I'm trying to condition the brain not to react with what would be the normal response for most people. The same thing, if you've driven in Austin traffic, you've probably had that, the fight or flight, right? Luckily, you're not capable of doing things from behind the wheel of the car that your brain is probably wanting you to do. But anyway, I think that the more we can provide that type of training, the reality-based, as close as we can get to reality without getting anybody hurt, the better we're starting to see that in the field. Again, we go to very basic brain science, and I think we're getting a little better with that in the training environment. We do a lot of reality-based stuff, including with simunitions rounds and simulated, physical altercations and all that. We see a better end product as a result.
I fire simunition rounds at Randy almost weekly, so.
Can I ask you, there's also nothing really new in that. I mean, police have been dealing with people getting in their face for a long time, and that's always been part of the training, and you've got to have the right disposition for it, and people have always spat at you and thrown rocks at you, and you know, the things we had in the 60s, the demonstrations, and into the 70s, there's nothing new with that. It's a lot more, it's a little bit more prominent now, and there's kind of and the social media really pushes that a lot further, and then everything's on camera, so we see everything that happens. But every day, in every state, for decades, police officers have had people getting in their face and trying to provoke them, and they've had to be trained to learn how to deal with that.
Ma'am.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your job. I appreciate you. My husband's law enforcement also at the federal level, and I appreciate you stepping up. But this is more of a request for Chair King. As he meets with the president, let him know that this is the face of the furlough. I'm from El Paso, Texas. My husband is Border Patrol. And let him know that I appreciate what he's doing, but this is the face of the money that is not being paid to the citizens of his nation. And although I do support it, I would like to see the laws that are already in the books enforced. I believe that if the laws are enforced, a lot of the issues wouldn't be happening. In El Paso, Texas, we don't see illegal immigration jumping over the fence. They're actually turning themselves in because they know that they're not going to be sent back to their country. We're keeping them in the nation, and I don't appreciate that. So more than that, it's a special request as you meet with him. Let him know that the Border Patrol is being demoralized because that's not the job they were hired to do.
Boy, that's so well said, and they do such a great job. And yeah, you're right, and I'll actually do my best to communicate that. So how long have you been in Border Patrol?
Almost 20 years.
Wow.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman right here. One in.
Hello, y'all. Chris McDonald, 24-year veteran police officer, serving the Harris County area as a lieutenant at this time. 2 questions. First of all, criminal justice reform is seeking to change 3 strikes and you're out rules due to overcrowding, or as we're calling it now, mass incarceration. However, those laws came into effect in the 90s whenever gang violence was prevalent. And as a result, we saw a trend downward now to the lowest levels of violent crime we've seen in 23 years. However, I'm seeing an upsurge of that happening again. My team has dealt with 4 shootings in the last 4 weeks involving gang members. We need those laws to stay. So the first question is, what are we going to do to ensure that we keep putting these bad guys away that are going to cause an upswing in crime? And secondly, how can we protect Class C arrest authority? I grant you that there are a few bad apples that'll do the piss off police arrest, but we need that tool still as law enforcement, as you know, when we're roving and patrolling at night, to be able to put someone in jail that we know is going to commit an offense, that non-burglar, that non-gang dealer, gangbanger. We need to still have that authority placed within us to be able to protect our citizens sleeping at night. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a real dilemma on the Class C. What he's talking about is Class C misdemeanors, which are like traffic tickets or things for minor assault and minor theft and that type of deal. Those don't actually have a criminal penalty associated with them. They're a fine-only offense. But you give somebody a ticket and they don't pay it, or you write somebody a ticket for shoplifting or something like that and they don't show up, then what do? Traditionally, we put them in jail. Harris County, on any given day, they have 10,000 people in the Harris County Jail. On any given day, a third of those are there on Class C misdemeanors. Frankly, a lot of them don't need to be in jail for that. But then what else do you do with them if they don't pay their tickets and they don't do these things? And you do need ways to pick some people up and get them off the street at different times or things like that. That's a really tough issue. The other part on Texas in 1987 had 37,000 prison beds, state prison beds, and they were full. By the law enforcement community came to the state and said, we need more prison beds. For every person you put in, you had to release somebody. The state went on a massive building program, and by 2007 had 154,000 prison beds. Problem was, nothing had really changed. Crime rates were essentially the same. We were doing a better job, I think, probably of holding violent offenders and things like that. But we had the second largest prison system in the world, I think. And so in 2007, I get my dates right. Yeah, in 2007, when the law enforcement came back again, the criminal justice system said, y'all need to build more prisons. We said, we've got 154,000 beds, we're full, we've got to try something different. So one of the things we tried was we tried to take some of that money, and instead of putting it into building more beds, we tried to put it into pretrial diversion programs, mental health assessments, and drug treatment. And jump ahead 10 years to 2017, we ended up, instead of building more prisons, we shut down 4, and I think are fixing to shut down a 5th one. And so kind of common sense kind of tells you there, if we've been doing a whole lot of this and it really hasn't made a big impact, but we've done a little bit of this and we've seen some impact, maybe we need to do more of this and a little bit less of this. The trick in that is, and what the lieutenant's talking about, the trick in that is you've got to do a great job of differentiating between violent offenders and nonviolent offenders. And the violent offenders, you've got to have the ability to lock them up and keep them locked up for as long as you have to. And that's where we're not doing a good job of doing that. We also are missing out on opportunities to really impact people on drug treatment and other things when they're young and new into the system. And we let them get very engrossed into the system and very addicted and very tied into crime and everything else because we just keep doing. So those early intervention, pre-trial, and a lot of the money we need to shift to there, that's really what we need to be focusing on. But what the lieutenant's talking about is they do need that Class C misdemeanor tool. And they do need to make sure that the violent offenders are clearly identified and kept away from everybody.
Randy.
It's hard to do both those.
I'm going to push back just a little bit on the Class C misdemeanor thing. You understand that what we're talking about is taking physical custody, right, of a person, take them to the police department for something that even if they're convicted of a crime, they would not serve jail time for. So that the actual arrest is more punitive than what they would receive should they actually be found guilty of the crime, at which time they are not at that time. So there's that issue from a philosophical standpoint. The other part of it is the Supreme Court has upheld pretextual stops, right, where I stop you for something other than what I really intend to do. So I stop you for not using your turn signal or not wearing your seatbelt, and then I want to, because I think you might have drugs in the car, and I want to get to that. It is a tool for law enforcement, but there's other ways that we can investigate this that would kind of hold to the spirit of the Constitution, right? That I'm not going to take you. You understand that you can be physically arrested for a traffic citation, right? Lago Vista, Texas, there was a Supreme Court decision from that city that said, yeah, arresting the woman for not wearing her seatbelt or not having her kid in a seatbelt is not a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Okay, it's a reasonable seizure. They didn't say it's a good idea. They kind of kicked that off to the states. But you could be arrested for that. I'm personally not a fan of the idea of charging somebody with, or arresting somebody for something other than what I can prove them to have done. Right? I wouldn't normally arrest you for not wearing your seatbelt. But if I'm doing that because I think you might be committing something else, I hate to say it, but I might be taking the lazy way out, right? I should probably investigate what you were doing and arrest you for that.
Well, actually, guys, that brings us right up to time. Thank you so much. We're going to have the panelists here for a few more minutes if you'd like to meet and greet, but we really appreciate you coming out and look forward to your participation in the rest of the day.